Hello and welcome to Crucible of Words for a little bit of bonus content on a Saturday. So last weekend I played a paper tournament with this deck, which is Green-Black Turbo Depths, which I've played on my channel recently as well, and I came third, going undefeated in the Swiss. So I thought I'd just have a little talk about the deck and how the tournament went. So the reason I opted to play the Turbo Depths build in Green-Black was because I wanted access to 4 Abrupt Decay, because Abrupt Decay answers a lot of the problem cards for the deck, things like Opposition Agent and Magus of the Moon that other things like Force of Vigor doesn't really answer. So it just felt like the right place to go. I actually like Dark Depths at the moment because I think Steely Resolve answers a lot of the problems you have with certain decks that have just a whole bunch of removal, like the Initiative deck. Now, the Initiative deck has started boarding in Leyline against us a little bit, but not everyone is onto that tech just yet. So how did our tournament go? So our first round was against a Naya Depths deck, where we made turn 2 Marit Lage, turn 3 Marit Lage, turn 4 Marit Lage, and then we lost the game eventually because we burned through all of our ways of making Marit Lage and our ways of protecting it, and our opponent was a lands deck with like Karakas, Maze of Ith, and their own Marit Lage. So we just didn't get on the first game, but then we just kind of did our thing in games 2 and 3, and you'll see a pattern here because we lost game 1 of every single round we played in the Swiss. So next up we had a round versus Cephalid Breakfast. Cephalid Breakfast is pretty reasonable matchup because we brought in these Steely Resolves and named Wizard, and then they don't get to target their creatures. So that's pretty good, and showing you the power of Steely Resolve as a piece of tech. Our third round was against a mono-red prison deck, and our opponent sat next to us the previous round, so they knew what we were playing, so they mulliganed to turn 1 Blood Moon against us, and we had an answer for that, but the turn we had an answer for it was the turn after they dropped their second Blood Moon, so we just kind of got it ruined there. But that matchup is really good, so game 2 and 3, we just used their Blood Moon to power out our 2020 and just had the Force of Vigors and the Abrupt Decays and the mana to cast them, and it was just fine. Being able to fetch basics in that matchup makes it very easy, so that's pretty good. Our next round was the Red-White Initiative deck. We had a really sweet play in that game where we had 2 Hexmages out and our opponent had a Chalice for 1, and our opponent had a lethal attacker on board, so we popped their Chalice down to 0 with 1 Hexmage, and then we fish out our Dark Depths using the crop rotation now that the Chalice was gone, and just make a 2020. And this was all in response to our opponent Shatter Skull smashing both of our Hexmages. So pretty nice bit of tech there. Our 5th round in the Swiss was against Mono Black Dalthy Helm. We managed to bait our opponent in the final game by cracking. So our opponent sort of drew a couple of cards over the course of turns and didn't do anything with them. So I had a fetch land, and I used this at my opponent's end step to try and bait the Opposition Agent, which I suspected they had, which worked. So they tried to flash in the Opposition Agent for the Verdant Catacombs activation. So in response, I just popped my crop rotation, which is what I actually wanted to resolve. Just got our combo and then finished our opponent off that way. So that matchup usually is a bit tricky because some of the builds have things like Sudden Edict in as well, which is a bit awkward, and obviously Opposition Agent is a problem, but that's why we've got all these Abrupt Decays on our sideboard, and they were pretty good. I think the matchup is better at the moment as well because a lot of them aren't running the Sudden Edicts because they're running Snuff Outs instead, so I think we're in a reasonable spot there. We also, in the first game of that one, our opponent went Basic Swamp, Basic Swamp Thoughtseize, and I had a Pithing Needle for my first turn, and I wasn't sure if I was what I should name. I ended up naming Wasteland because that's normally what you want to name, but I was really tempted to name Calm because of the Swamp Thoughtseize, and it turns out if I'd have named that, I would have probably won that game quite handily as well. But again, we lost game 1, but we won game 2 and 3, and then we just got to ID into top 8 at that point. And then in the quarterfinal, I played against Dredge, which was piloted by the Magic the Gathering Online user, the Daddy, who is kind of like one of my Magic Online heroes because he's always playing Dredge, and I love that deck. So I played against him, and obviously we've got these 4 Leylines in our sideboard, so it was pretty horrible for him. It wasn't really much of a game. And then the semi-final was against Mono White Initiative, where turn 1, I made a 2020 with Not of This World backup and killed my opponent. Game 2, I kept a strange hand. I think I mulled 6 and kept a hand with all of the pieces, like all the protection we needed, and some mana ramp and a Thespian stage, anything, but we didn't have the Dark Depths. So we were trying to draw into one of our 12 cards. Now, we did eventually draw it, but it was probably one turn too late, which was the issue. So we went quite a few turns into that game without seeing our piece, and it was a bit unfortunate, really. I think I would probably still keep that hand, but it was kind of marginal because normally I would want to mull to a way that puts a Dark Depths into play. But I think it was still fine, and I would probably do it again. And then the final round, our opponent made a turn 1 White Plume Adventurer, and we didn't have enough time to play a Steely Resolve to protect ourselves and make our 2020 because the clock was too quick. So we made our 2020 and they had an answer for it. They showed me afterwards they also had an answer for our Steely Resolve in the form of Loran, so the turn we took off wouldn't have actually mattered. So it was a pretty tight game, I think, but we unfortunately lost that one. And then our opponent, she went on to win the event in beating Doomsday in the final. And I recorded a video with her deck list on Wednesday, I think it went up. So you can have a look at that. So yeah, this is the deck. My thoughts after having played the tournament with it would be that the Karakas main deck is probably not necessary. I think I would almost rather have a second Boseiju, because having green source of mana is really important. And Boseiju is one of the things that you want to tutor for most in this deck. It answers a lot of problem cards, especially in game 1, where you don't really have a lot in the way of answers. It's just really nice to have as an option. So I think maybe a second Boseiju would be better than the Karakas. Especially since the way that you're beating Reanimator usually here is the Bojuka Bog, rather than the Karakas. Like, you can get the Karakas after the fact, or to push through your thing. And it's also the Karakas is for Sneak and Show, which is a matchup that's kind of fallen by the wayside. I think in paper, I would be more inclined to have 2 Boseiju. But online, I think the Karakas is a lot closer to whether you want a second Boseiju or not, because online there's a lot more reanimatory type decks. Other than that, I'm very happy with this deck, and I'd happily snap it off and play in a tournament again. If you watch my channel, you know I love making 2020s, and turns out I'm pretty alright at doing that. I do prefer the black-green build over the rainbow build at the moment, but I know some people are experimenting with a rainbow build that has Phyrexian Dreadnought Mycosynth Gardens in, which is interesting. Obviously, I don't necessarily think that's going to be as good, straight up, because it's got a lot more moving pieces and it seems slightly easier to disrupt instead of just this thing that reliably does what it does. Like I said, in one of the rounds we made Marit Lage 4 turns in a row or whatever. So, yeah, big fan of playing the Dark Depths decks, and I hope this little tournament recap for you was interesting. Alright, thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Love to hear it. Goodbye.